Kluber. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships, and it's my delight to welcome you to our final Global Briefing Series seminar of this semester. And we do these events several times a semester to help our faculty, our students, and our community really get access to understanding some of the global trends shaping the world. Tonight is a special privilege for me because I get to bring in an old friend of mine, Dr. Shawn Powers from the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And let me give you just a little brief update on Shawn Powers. I'm sure you've seen his biography. Dr. Powers is currently the Chief Strategy Officer at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which I think is the coolest job title ever. So you should strive for a Chief Strategy Officer. That's really cool. Prior to that, he was the Executive Director of the U.S. Commission on Public Diplomacy, where he looked at all U.S. public diplomacy efforts in coordination with the Department of State to evaluate their effectiveness and their scope. Prior to that, he was a professor with tenure at Georgia State University. He is an academic in training and in heart, even though he's also a government bureaucrat now. But he really has done exceptional work looking at global media, looking at the new media technologies, digital media, and understanding their impact on geopolitics. And currently he oversees all these, I'll ask him to explain a little bit about the Agency for Global Media and what he does there. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Shawn Powers.
Good evening, folks. Can you hear me okay? In the back? Yeah? Okay. Looking at Zach. Dean Kluber, thank you for that warm and kind and generous introduction. I feel like I should pay you and you can introduce me to every conversation I go to because everything gets a lot easier if you've got that kind of introduction. And thank you, Dean Kluber, to you and your entire staff for a wonderful trip and visit and the opportunity to engage with your students and faculty and the broader Stillwater community. This is really a great opportunity. I love being back on a college campus. I miss being at a university so much. Washington, D.C. is both wonderful but highly stressful, as you can imagine, regardless of your politics. It is a fascinating and exhausting time to be living in Washington, D.C. And so it's really nice to be here, and I'm really thrilled. So thank you for the opportunity. I wanted to chat a little bit today about the agency that I work for, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and then talk connected to some big picture questions about the future of technology and geopolitics. And hopefully we've got plenty of time for Q&A as well, because I want to hear from you and make sure that we're connecting on some important questions. In 2017, when I was still at the Advisory Commission, and I just transitioned from academia, I co-authored or co-edited this report, Can Public Diplomacy Survive the Internet? Bots, echo chambers, and disinformation. And the basic premise was we were just kind of realizing the full extent of efforts to manipulate deliberations and digital dialogue in 2016, both in the US election, but also in Brexit. And fully understanding the scope of activities that impacted our digital discourse, for me, was an eye-opening moment to think about what does the future of public diplomacy look like? How do we engage with foreign audiences using these technologies if the same technologies that we're relying on are increasingly being used to manipulate public opinion, to fake human beings, creating a bot account to make it seem as though a real human is behaving online when in reality it's just a piece of software. If all of the tools and platforms that we're relying at the State Department or at USAGM, if all of those tools and platforms are equally vulnerable to these manipulations, then how are people going to believe anything that they see that comes from us on these platforms? And it was sort of an existential moment, because if we can't solve that question, why are we investing millions and millions of dollars in Facebook engagement and Twitter engagement? What is the value of these investments if we aren't really thinking about the platforms themselves and the risks they introduce to our efforts? I finished this report, and I know actually a number of you have read it because it's assigned in a couple of classes, which is really an honor. And for me, it was a wonderful experience and a wonderful project, but I couldn't help but say, now what? So I've identified a problem, the risk of computational propaganda, and I've identified some solutions. But at the Advisory Commission, that was the full extent of my authorities, right? I didn't have operational capacities or responsibilities to then say, okay, State Department, it is time to get better at this stuff. And so, and that was frustrating for me. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I transitioned to the U.S. Agency for Global Media to do exactly that, which is move to the operational side and try to address some of the issues that were raised in this report and really think about how we maintain a credible relationship with foreign publics and have a meaningful dialogue with them that isn't vulnerable to the kinds of digital manipulation that we've seen in 2016 and seen since then. If you don't mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. Agency for Global Media, just so you can understand where I'm coming from. And it's a relatively small agency, so I know a number of you probably have never heard of it. And it was recently renamed, which also adds to the confusion. Though the renaming was a good decision, and you'll see why in a minute. Up until last August of 2018, the agency was called the Broadcasting Board of Governors. That's a mouthful. Okay, that's a hard title to reel off in the middle of a talk. And it confused people because they hear the word governors and they're like, okay, so you're a state association of some sort. And they hear broadcasting and they're like, is that even a thing anymore, right? Because we've got mobile phones and Facebook, so what are you doing? And the title obviously was a relic of the roots of the agency, which goes back to the World War II and started with the launch of Voice of America, which aimed to bring truth and credible news reporting about the war effort to a variety of countries throughout the world, but especially in Europe. And so the renaming of the agency was really appropriate and an important kind of step in the modernization of our agency to recognize that we're not really just talking about broadcast technologies anymore. We're talking about media in the full spectrum of the word, from digital to shortwave radio to printed materials as well, all of which are, of course, media. Part of what drew me to the U.S. Agency for Global Media is the mission of the agency, which is both remarkably simple and incredibly complicated at the same time. Our mission, which is defined in legislation, is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. It's simple in that I can articulate this, and everyone in this room has a pretty clear sense of what those words mean, right? All of our programs, every single one of our media programs, every single one of our broadcasts or tweets can be assessed. Is it helping to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy? And that direct connection to a mission is really helpful when you're thinking about where should resources go? What's the best way to spend our money? What's the best allocation of human resources? We can connect it back to that mission. It's a privilege to be able to work for an organization that has that straightforward of a mission. And it's one of the areas where we oftentimes work alongside the State Department, which of course is supportive of efforts to increase access to information, especially information that supports freedom and democracy. But the State Department's mission is much broader, right? The State Department advances the broader foreign policy goals of the United States government, which always includes access to information, but can include any number of other issues. And that's an interesting place for us because while we work closely with the State Department when we can, there are times where we're at direct odds because advancing the mission of giving folks access to information in support of freedom and democracy sometimes can hurt our bilateral relationship with a foreign government. And I'll give some examples of when those issues come up and how we try to handle them. The reason why this is complicated is because media freedom around the world is collapsing at a pace that is terrifying. Every single report that comes out assessing the state of media freedom around this world indicates that governments are emboldened in cracking down on reporters. They're emboldened on limiting access to information. They're emboldened on deploying surveillance tools and techniques to monitor their citizens, monitor journalists. There are more journalists in jail today than there have been in the last 25 years. The violence against journalists is on the rise. And so while our mission is simple, it is also extraordinarily complex and important because there are fewer and fewer people around the world willing to do the work that is needed to provide free access and open access to trustworthy information. The agency oversees 5 public service news networks. The most well-known is the Voice of America. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Voice of America, and don't cheat. It's okay if you have not. Very good. It's been around for a very long time. It is the largest network. They produce content in, gosh, there was an update this morning about this. They produce content in 45 languages and operate in over 100 countries, and so it's a remarkable effort. But there are 4 other public service networks that we oversee that are of equal importance from my perspective. That includes Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is based in Prague and broadcasts or creates content in 22 different languages, primarily focusing on the former Soviet republics and Central and Eastern Europe. We also oversee Radio Free Asia, which operates in Asia, obviously. The Middle East Broadcasting Network was launched in the aftermath of 2001, obviously to deal with the question of how do we engage better with the Arabic-speaking population in the Middle East primarily. And it's a remarkable endeavor, and I'll show some examples of work they're doing as well. And then the final network, the 5th, is the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, based in Miami, whose sole job is to get free, current, and fact-based information into Cuba, which still is one of the most closed media environments in the entire world. So altogether, those 5 networks represent the work that we do. The agency's budget is about $808 million, and I'm going to talk about the impact that we have, but from my perspective, it's a remarkable return on investment for the US taxpayer. When you think about the billions of dollars that are spent building airplanes, the billions of dollars that are spent building missiles, and the less than $1 billion we spend on promoting free access to information, we're really doing a tremendous job. Crucial to our ability to do that is the firewall. A lot of folks hear the name U.S. Agency for Global Media. They hear that we're funded by the U.S. government, and they presume that we are an extension of U.S. foreign policy. And to a certain extent, that is true, inasmuch as our mission, which is to promote free access to information in order to promote democracy, which is also a U.S. foreign policy goal, we do coincide in that way. But the work that our journalists do, our 3,800 journalists all around the world, is completely independent and firewalled from any political interference. And so I live as part of the senior leadership of the agency. I live on the federal side and am actually prohibited from advising on the kinds of content that our journalists can pursue. I can't make a recommendation for a story. I can't say you should actually interview this person instead of this person. That would be a violation of the firewall, which is actually in 2 different pieces of congressional legislation which protect our journalists from any political interference, even from this jerk who tries to help the agency do a better job. And that firewall, it cannot be overstated in terms of its importance. Our journalists rely on it and deploy it often to make sure that the audiences understand that they are independent of the US government, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who's the majority in Congress. And oftentimes they have to remind folks when they're interviewing them that there is a firewall and that any efforts to influence their coverage is actually against the law. What's interesting about this piece is politicians influence journalists all around the world, right? So the State Department has a robust team of folks whose job it is to influence journalists and get them to cover the stories that the State Department wants them to cover and to get them to cover them in a way that is favorable to US foreign policy. And because other journalistic organizations are generally private enterprises, there is no law that says that those activities are illegal. So we stand aside in a very unique way, which is to say we are the only journalistic institution in the world whose journalists are actually legally protected from influence by a law. Even the New York Times can't say that. And that's something we actually really like to promote and note because it helps our audiences understand that our journalists are doing what they're doing for the purpose of a public service mission, to improve access to information and to tell stories that are otherwise not being told, either due to political censorship or to a lack of market opportunities to support a free and independent media in the countries that we're operating in. There's actually, well, I'll get there. Here is a map, and you can't see some of the colors too well, but it's actually a list of all of the different languages that we currently create content and disseminate content in. We're currently operating in 61 different languages, and I want folks to take a minute and think about, if I asked you to close your eyes and list as many languages as you possibly could, do you think you could even list 61 languages? I know I couldn't, and I give this presentation often, right? It's something that, as someone who's studied the agency as an academic and worked closely with the agency at the commission, I never fully appreciated what it means to produce content and disseminate content in 61 languages. First of all, we're talking about over 4,000 hours of original radio and video content a week across these 61 languages. So it's not just a couple of websites. This is a robust media enterprise. But the real challenge is there are no electronic systems that support 61 languages. Swear to God. For a news organization, you need things called content management systems or media asset management systems. These are the back-end tools that allow you to share B-roll footage, to share access to all the reporting that's been done, to allow shared editing processes. It is the foundation of a successful multimedia operation. We looked high and low around the world for any content management system that would support multiple languages. And the best we could find was a CMS that supported 11 languages. 11. We have 61. And think about that when you scale it across the agency's operations, from data analytics to financial accountability. We have to build each of these systems ourselves because there is no commercial solution. And that's a remarkable endeavor. The fact that we have the back-end support to build all of the infrastructure that's required to operate in 61 languages is actually a remarkable endeavor and something I didn't fully appreciate until I joined the agency. The most recent addition to this list is Rohingya, which is on the right side under East Asia. A couple of months ago, and I'm thrilled because this was partially my idea. One of the first things I did when I joined USAGM. If you think about our mission, which is to provide access to information, truthful information in parts of the world where there is none, who's the most information-deprived population you could think of? Who really is struggling to get access to information that's based on facts, it's truthful, in their native language? Refugees. Someone said it over here. It's refugees, a population that's growing fast, unfortunately, and there is, in most circumstances, no one who's sitting around worrying about how do refugee populations access information in a language that they understand to be true about their home country. And so from my perspective, it's a human rights issue, it's a humanitarian issue. We have an obligation to do our best to get good information about what's going on in their home countries to these folks. But I'm not gonna lie, it's also a strategic opportunity. Because if we don't fill that gap, other people will, and those people will have far worse intentions than what we have. There's enough going on in any given refugee's life that the least we could do is provide them some current access to information that helps them reconnect with their homeland. So a couple months ago, we launched Rohingya Radio for Rohingya refugee population based in Bangladesh, almost 1 million refugees there. It's going remarkably well. We actually had to go to the camps and hand out a bunch of medium wave and shortwave radios, which is the best way to get access to folks in those camps right now because the cell towers to the refugee camps are highly regulated and oftentimes shut down to limit access to information. And it's something we're expanding to other refugee camps in Africa and, of course, the Middle East. So that's the 61st language that we have here. The 62nd language that we're adding in March of 2020 is Hungarian, and it's not a new language for us. We used to actually have 2 different efforts in Hungary. Both Radio Free Europe and Voice of America operated there. We pulled out of Hungary after the Cold War, when Hungary was on a stable path towards democracy. Do we have anyone in the room who knows what's going on in Hungary these days? It's not on a stable path towards democracy anymore. Every single independent assessment of the environment there says it's stumbling quickly towards authoritarian governance. The current leadership there is draconianly opposed to free and independent press. And so we made the decision earlier this year to relaunch in Hungary to try to provide some free and independent news to Hungarians. It's a very difficult language, by the way. If anyone speaks it, you're hired, basically. It's really hard. But this is a good example. So this administration has been improving the US government's relationship with the government of Hungary. And when we announced our thoughts to actually launch a Radio Free Europe stream in Hungarian, the US ambassador to Hungary called me up and said, "This is a terrible idea. And if you do it, you're gonna devastate our bilateral relationship with the government of Hungary." And I was in the fortunate position of not reporting to the US ambassador to Hungary. And as much as it was an important conversation to have, I informed him that my job was to serve my agency, which is to promote freedom and access to information and independent press, And his bilateral relationship with the government of Hungary was not my primary or tertiary concern. And so it's an interesting example for me of we do work alongside the broader foreign policy apparatus of the United States government, but when push comes to shove, we often have to make decisions that are actually at odds with the bilateral considerations of our ambassadors. Part of how we do what we do is through a network of global affiliates. So we have a robust transmission system that includes a variety of radio signals, satellite TV signals. Obviously, the internet is crucial. But one of the most important ways we get our content into countries around the world is through our network of affiliates. And so we've got about 3,500 affiliates. These are local TV and radio and sometimes digital online properties that have a contractual agreement with the agency to carry a certain amount of our content at a certain period of time every day or every week. And this allows us to, in a lot of cases, avoid having to seek a broadcast license, which can be incredibly difficult, and sometimes it's impossible because folks don't want to give out broadcast licenses to foreign governments. In particular, in large parts of Asia and Latin America, this is the best way to get our content in front of folks where they access content. And what's been really cool is it's a win-win. So for the affiliates, they see this as a way to have a de facto bureau in Washington, D.C. So in Latin America in particular, a lot of our programs are Voice of America's Latin American coverage, which is based in Washington, D.C., and covers local politics, just like it would cover local politics if it was broadcasting to any one of you all. Rather than have thousands of local TV stations each have a bureau in Washington, D.C., which is expensive, they rely on Voice of America to cover that piece of the world. And it's a wonderful win-win. They get to use their resources for local investigative journalism in the countries that they operate in. And then, of course, we get an opportunity to engage with audiences that are co-branded with these very well-trusted local TV and radio stations. And so it's a really important piece of how we get into households all around the world. I could talk about our content all day long, but the best way to give you a sense of the work of our journalists is actually to show you a couple of clips. The first clip is a Middle East broadcasting network. Al-Hora TV is the name of it. Al-Hora TV was relaunched about 13 months ago from scratch, basically. It was, I'll speak frankly for a minute, it was a failed endeavor for a long period of time. It was not well structured or operated from 2001 until about 2016. We brought in a new lead for the station who did a wonderful job. He fired a lot of people. And brought on a lot of good talent. And the relaunch has been remarkably effective. We've seen double-digit percentage increases in most of the markets we operate in, including places like Syria, Iraq, and the Palestinian territories. And so this is a summary of some of their coverage lately, which has been crucial. If you think about the Middle East, you're seeing quite a bit of political activity, especially in Syria and Iraq. And so their jobs are remarkably difficult, but obviously they're doing a pretty good job.
هم اليوم أي مشروع دي يسووه بتقرص الناس.
This is audio controls. Master wow.
لا يجوز. It's not fair.
عناصر من الشرطة في هجوم مسلح بسكين على مركز.
ربع العراقيين يرزحون تحت خط الفقر.
يتظاهرون في شوارع.
تابعونا في هذه البلدة حيث أطلق
إذا عقد مجلس
العراق لا ينضم إلينا.
والسعودية بين هذا المنطقة.
I use my time today to condemn the regime's support to proxies in Iraq.
We look for the help of the United States and the help of the international community.
القرار في واشنطن لرسم الصورة الكاملة.
تابعين لا للتيار الصدري، لا للسيستاني، لا سني، لا شيعي.
Pretty compelling stuff, especially if you consider the markets they're operating in. Doing that kind of coverage from within Iraq is exceedingly difficult. Al-Hura produced a mini documentary about 6 weeks ago on financial corruption among the Sunni and Shia religious elites in Iraq. And it was the first documented effort to expose substantial levels of corruption amongst the religious elite. And we know it was effective because every major politician in Iraq screamed from the top of their lungs that this was a problematic content. They called the US ambassador, they called folks close to Secretary Pompeo and said, this has to be taken down. You have to apologize for it. And from our perspective, when you get everyone yelling at you, it typically means you've touched a nerve in a way that's right. Before it went live, we knew it was controversial, so we actually had 2 separate fact checkers assess the validity of the coverage, and both came back and said it was 100% true based on the evidence that was presented. But still, of course, people don't like to hear the truth sometimes. It's the kind of stuff that we can pursue that a for-profit journalistic endeavor can't. Because if a for-profit journalistic endeavor pursues that story, they're never going to report in Iraq again. Right? And they're not going to make money. They're going to get boycotts of their advertising as a result of that. We don't care about advertising. We're a public service media institution, and our goal is to cover things that no one else will and to tell some fact-based stories. The algorithm is fascinating here, by the way, about what is recommended based on the Al-Hura video. Not something I chose. I want to show one more video. I can do this. From Radio Free Asia, which again focuses on news coverage in Asia. One of Radio Free Asia's target markets is North Korea. Obviously, we've got no journalists in North Korea. North Korea is literally the most draconian country in the world when it comes to access to information. Accessing foreign media, news or entertainment, is a crime that's punishable by death and actually is, on occasion, punished by a public hanging. There is no more difficult place to operate. We don't pretend to have journalists on the ground in North Korea. We do have lots of journalists in South Korea that stay in close contact with folks in North Korea, and that is the genesis for our programming. Between Radio Free Asia and Voice of America, we produce 13 hours of original content that's then broadcast into North Korea every night. The reason why it's broadcast at night is, well, it's illegal to access our content, so you wouldn't want to broadcast during the day when most people are at work. So we broadcast at night when a lot of folks turn on their radios when they're in bed and can listen to it privately in the quiet of their own homes. We know that our efforts there are successful because we do a survey of North Korean defectors every year. We've interviewed over 2,000 North Korean defectors over the course of 15 or 20 years now. And they can identify our brands, they can identify specific programs. They talk about the importance of these programs in their thinking about what the outside world looks like, because inside of North Korea, it's an entirely controlled information environment. This is a short video that I found really touching. It was just aired about 2 weeks ago, and it's long. The actual show is longer than this, but this is a short clip. We followed a defector family. Defecting from North Korea is, of course, a high-risk endeavor. It's dangerous. Even once you get out of North Korea, the vast majority of defectors come through China, and it's illegal to be a North Korean defector in China. So you basically have to live underground and then get smuggled through a variety of countries and hopefully find your way to South Korea. It is a remarkably grueling and expensive and humbling endeavor. And so we had a journalist in bed with a family that was of defectors. And here's a short clip from it. I've got to say, does anyone have small children? I do too. And there's a 2-year-old that's a part of the defector family. For me, seeing the 2-year-old defect from North Korea was very touching.
우리가 지금 흰 차고 그리고 저거 뭐죠? 예. 그러면 그쪽에 가서 이제 그 전화를 그걸 이제 그 깜빡깜빡하셔.
찾았다.
천천히. 지금. 이제 진짜 해?
그러니까.
갈까요? 어머니 가세요.
맞아, 일로 가면 맞아요.
맞아.
I meant to mention the faces were blurred for safety reasons, obviously. I want to speed forward a little bit because I really do want to get to the question of can public diplomacy survive the internet? So maybe I'll just leave this here and we can go back to this later on in the Q&A if folks are curious about the kinds of things we're pursuing in the next 12 to 24 months to make sure that we're competitive. Includes artificial intelligence, digital first strategies, and some more refugee projects that I mentioned. But I do want to talk just briefly about how we know we're effective. In 2019, we reached 350 million adults on a weekly basis through each of our 5 networks in total. That's an increase in our audience from 345 million the year before, and a substantial increase from each of the years before that. We know that our journalist products are in high demand because people are flooded with a variety of information from any number of sources, and they still come back to our brands increasingly more frequently, and sharing our content is also increasing every time we measure it. So we know we're connecting with audiences around the world, and we know we're doing a good job as a result of that. We do extensive digital analytics as well, which aren't represented here. These are all surveys, actually. So we actually know day in, day out, in real time, how many folks are on our websites and how much time they spend there, and what they do with the content, which is a fascinating endeavor in and of itself. One interesting thing about the weekly reach is radio and TV are substantial and important to that weekly reach. I think a lot of us think that the internet is it, right? We all consume our news on our smartphones increasingly, maybe on our laptops. But around the world, we see that TV and radio are still crucial and staying strong, and I suspect they're going to stay strong for a very long time. Internet is, of course, growing, and it will continue to grow, but we can't abandon what we call legacy mediums because they're still crucial for large parts of our audience, especially in parts of Asia and Africa. Okay, so let's get to the fun stuff. Can public diplomacy survive the internet? In the report that I showed the cover of earlier, we paint a pretty dire picture of the future of public diplomacy that's basically an internet that is filled with computational propaganda bots trying to propagandize one another. And if you've read it, it's terrifying. It'll keep you up at night. It's not a fun scene. But I think we're actually making some good progress here. And I think we've got some solutions, or at least a path forward that's worthy of thinking about. One piece of that is it's no longer an internet. I think it's unfair to describe the global communication ecosystem or infrastructure as an internet. What we now have is a series of intranets, which is primarily ecosystems that are governed either by countries or by technology companies that have individual sets of rules that sometimes interconnect and allow for the sharing of information, but increasingly are disconnected. And in particular, if you think about the digital ecosystem that China has created, the digital ecosystem that Iran and Russia have created, increasingly those ecosystems have fewer touch points with the internet that most of you are familiar with. And that trend is growing because the technologies that allow for these intranets to develop are being sold at low cost by China and Russia in particular to a variety of governments who are keen to control their information environments. So the question is not, can public diplomacy survive the internet? It is, can it survive the intranets? And I think that's where US AGM has a unique approach to this because we can approach each market on its own terms and think about a solution based on what technologies are prioritized and what are the needs of the citizens. I'll give a couple examples. I've got three examples to talk through. The first is Iraq. So in about a month ago, October was marked by a resurgence of protests against corruption, unemployment, and poor public services in Iraq. The government, as a result of those protests, mandated a block of social media, which took effect on October 1st, resulting in a surge of users on the Siphon anti-censorship network. Siphon is a network, it's a circumvention tool that my office funded about 7 years ago. It's a classic VPN technology that is sophisticated in that it can sense how governments are trying to restrict access to information and then create a specific route around those tactics based on how sophisticated the government is. It is one of the finest circumvention tools in the world, and we've built Siphon not as an independent tool, though you can download it on your phone and use it as such. We've built it into the back end of all of our applications. And so if you open up Middle East Broadcasting Al-Hurra's application, Siphon is built into it, so you don't have to download anything else. And then the application itself assesses the circumvention or the censorship problems it faces and routes the traffic around any firewalls without the user even knowing it, really. It may be a little bit slower, but it's a really, really cool tool. When the Iraqi government banned access to social media sites, we saw a remarkable spike in Siphon use in Iraq. And you probably can't see the fine print here, but on the left side of the chart, you see something in the range of about 25,000 users of Siphon. And on the right side of the chart, you're looking at 2.5 million. So an increase of over 2 million users of the Siphon network, which allowed folks to access information on social networks that otherwise would not be able to access those networks. And that was crucial for us because it allowed people to actually post videos and information about how the protests were going, so we could then use that to report on. Then, of course, also use these tools to get information back into the hands of Iraqis. It's a really good example for me about how even though the internet is a vulnerable platform and governments can ban access to a variety of parts of it, that if we invest in the right tools, we can always find ways to get information into the hands of the folks that need it most. This is still in Iraq. It's a pretty remarkable increase, not just in terms of users, but also in terms of the bytes that were transferred. And so it's, again, hard to read these numbers, but we're talking about 247 terabytes of information on average per day were transmitted by Iraqis. 247 terabytes of information. That's pretty remarkable. And it's on par with the kind of media consumption that we would expect from Western audiences. So we know that folks were actively engaged with our tool to get information out and to access information. A bit more of a recent example, which is a bit scarier, frankly. Anyone hear about what happened in Iran on Saturday? So the government announced a major tariff on petrol, on gas. Depending on where you live, the tax was an additional 50% to 300%. Protests erupted immediately upon the announcement. Iran is in a very vulnerable economic position right now, and that tax in a number of neighborhoods is going to make getting food on the table really hard for a lot of folks. The protests erupted immediately and were robust, and the Iranian government reacted equally swiftly by shutting down the entirety of the Iranian internet. It's the most robust internet shutdown we've ever witnessed, and it's a very sophisticated operation to shut down. Iran had over 300 touch points with the global internet, and each one of those 300 touch points was shut down with a small exception of a couple of touch points that the government uses itself for major financial transactions and for their own Twitter accounts. No joke, the Iranian government kept their connectivity so they could tweet about how things were going fine, while shutting down all access to the internet for its citizenry. What was extraordinary is it wasn't just internet access, they also shut down all of the cell phone networks. And so obviously cell phone use of data was impossible, but also calling people was quite difficult. This presents a unique challenge for us because most of the circumvention tools that we deployed rely on some level of connectivity. Siphon, the tool I just talked about, it requires connectivity, and then it routes around the country that it's trying to censor the information, but you still need that basic level of connectivity. If you shut down all connectivity, Siphon doesn't help you at all. And so we need to come up with some new solutions, which we did. This, by the way, is a chart. This is the Siphon dashboard. You can see on the right-hand side the drop in users. That's how drastic it was when they turned off access to the internet. It was literally 1 minute you're on, 1 minute you're off. It went from 25,000 active users to about 2,500 in a matter of minutes. So what do we do? Interestingly enough, Iran is a tough nut to crack, so to speak. And so we maintain a robust series of transmission sites that allow us to broadcast medium wave and shortwave radio into Iran and another number of other countries. Shortwave radio is, I'm sure almost no one under the age of 30 in this room knows anything about it. If you do, more power to you. But it's a technology that was really mastered during the Cold War and allows us to broadcast radio signals across the world, basically, about 3,500 miles. It bounces a signal off of one of the spheres. It's remarkably powerful, remarkably hard to jam as well, because it's basically scattering information in a vast array of directions. And so it's really hard to shut down those signals. So of course we doubled down on our shortwave and medium wave transmission. Medium wave is AM, so it goes about 150 miles depending on the power, to make sure that folks could access some forms of information. And based on survey data we've collected over the years, we know that folks go to radio when the internet is shut down or throttled in Iran. So we know that there's some audience there. It's not the same audience. Not everyone's going to go to shortwave radio, but we know enough folks are there. And the point there is you got to still connect with folks and try to get the word out. Last example, I was talking to some students yesterday about what I should talk about, and they mentioned, can you give us an example of digital diplomacy that works? And I said, tough one, but I've got a really good example, and I love this example. So Uzbekistan, which, has anyone been to Uzbekistan? Wonderful. Fascinating place.
All summer there.
Fascinating place. Not known for its welcoming approach to journalists or journalism. Really in the bottom 5% of countries as it relates to journalists. And I know I'm short on time, so I'll make this really quick. All of our Radio Free Europe journalists got kicked out of Uzbekistan a number of years ago, and we found it really difficult to cover affairs there. But we had a really innovative young kid running the Uzbek service, and someone who really loved social media and Telegram in particular, an application that's hyper secure, but it basically allows you to create your own social networks. And so he built a series of Telegram channels in Uzbekistan that allow for a robust series of citizen reporting of problems to a central archive on the channel that then we fact check, verify, and then report out as if it's news on a separate Telegram channel. It's a fairly basic concept, right? Citizen journalism is something that's been around for a while. The value added here is Telegram protects the anonymous nature of the sources of information. So a government employee can actually say, hey, look, I see corruption in my agency, and that person can feel comfortable that they're not going to be outed because the application itself protects their identity. And then what we add really is the fact checking. So we had a robust series of folks inside of Uzbekistan that would help us mold the stories to make sure that they're based on facts. As of last week, the Uzbekistan Telegram network that we've created had 50,000 active users and can claim responsibility for the resignation of over a dozen lawmakers because they've exposed levels of corruption that had otherwise been untouched. The most exciting piece of this is, and what they spend most of their time working on, is actually not high-level corruption, but basic public services that are lacking. So there was a huge story about how the garbage in a couple of neighborhoods had not been picked up for over 6 months. We posted pictures of it through our Telegram channel, verified it, of course, and as a result, the garbage was picked up the next day. And we've got a bunch of these sort of small examples, but you know you're doing good work when the government's actually reacting to your coverage and fixing a problem that was having tangible consequences in people's lives. And so for me, it's a fun example of how the internet can be dark and scary, but there are always opportunities to use it for good. So thank you for letting me go on a bit longer than I had hoped. I'd like to see if we've got some time for Q&A, Dean Kluver, if that works for you.
And if you would like to ask a question, let me bring the microphone to you so that we can capture. Please don't ask a question without the microphone. This is how we get you on video.
So how is USAGM and the State Department preparing for deepfakes in voice emulating software?
Yeah, which is something that I raised the awareness of for the State Department in that report. So we've partnered with the BBC and CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, on deepfake detection technology, which is also partially funded by DARPA. So I'd say it's really a whole of multiple governments approach. And that is going relatively well. And I think will be effective. Here's the challenge. Even if we can automatically detect a deepfake, the damage is done the second it's posted. So even if I know 10 seconds later that a deepfake is a deepfake, the risk is that if someone deepfakes President Trump declaring war, what happens in the 10 seconds before I can say, stop, it's a deepfake? And what risks are involved there? And we don't have a solution to that quite yet. It's a terrifying part of the job. Fortunately, ironically, deepfake technology is most actively utilized in an industry that's not known to government. It's in the pornography industry, because there's a lot of money to be made there. And so in that way, we've bought ourselves some time in finding solutions, but it is a very concerning trend.
Somebody else, another question?
When talking about freedom or open-based journalism or just open voice, what is your personal opinion about the suppression of free speech in public colleges?
Oh, interesting. Is there an example you want to point to? Is this? I mean, in the United States or abroad? Yeah.
Here at home, because follow by example.
Yeah. Okay. No, I gotcha. When I was an academic, I taught media law as one of my courses. These free speech questions are fascinating and fun. Look, I'm a free speech, advocate, evangelist. I think it's one of the most foundational parts of any democratic system, including any university. I don't want to step into a sensitive issue here at Oklahoma State. I don't know if that's what's going on here, and so I won't comment on any specifics. But in particular, at a university, when we're dealing with adults, free speech needs to be protected absolutely by to the full extent of the First Amendment. I do find myself asking the same question though about at what point does responsibility kick in? When you've got the question of deep fakes, do First Amendment rights protect someone's deep fake rights? And that's a really fascinating question, especially when you can suspect that most folks are using deepfakes to either make a lot of money, but also to probably hurt the credibility of the reputation of people and institutions, which of course then gets into an area of law which does allow for the regulation of speech. And I don't think where your question was going, but I do think the legal apparatus that governs free speech is going to be severely tested in the next couple of years based on the different ways in which folks can communicate openly and manipulate the information systems.
In the book, you mentioned something about that it's important to measure engagement with the media. And my question is, which tools could we use it to measure that engagement in media?
Yeah, it's a good question. Every news organization has purchased a bunch of off-the-shelf tools that Facebook and other social platforms provide to give you a sense for how you're engaging folks on their platforms. The problem is those tools are really based for advertisers, right? To get a sense for if your advertising is working. And like I said before, we're not advertising. We don't care about advertising. We want to know if we're producing content that's meaningful and having an impact on the way people see their lives. So we're actually investing in our own metrics to assess the efficacy of our digital efforts because we don't want to be dependent on these market-based solutions. One metric that's really interesting that I think is worth talking about is levels of engagement per 1,000 fans or followers. And so it's a way to compare apples to apples. Oftentimes you'll hear this channel has 2 million followers on YouTube versus this channel which has 3 million. Well, they're in different languages, and those different languages are spoken by vastly different numbers of people. So you can't compare those things. But if you look at active engagement of your content per 1,000 loyal users, you can actually get a pretty good sense for how you're performing over time and compare different markets to one another. So that's one that we're actually really investing in and sort of building into all of our systems. It's a big conversation about metrics, but that's one that we're pretty excited about.
My question is based on part of the conversation we had earlier, but this is in a different dimension. I know your agencies focus majorly on outside the United States, how you can actually work more on the soft power of the United States. But you've also raised concern about budgetary limitation for your agency. And of course, we know that back in the United States right now, we have the information warfare going on. And we have, from example of countries that have been able to, a certain level, be able to work on their digital platform to prevent against disinformation. The United States is not on the list of the first 6 right now. And are you so concerned that at policy level, budgetary level, and political inclination, that the United States doesn't really have that willingness right now to face the problem head on? So, because it's a question I keep asking myself, where will the US be in the current cyberspace going by what is happening right now in the next 5 years?
Yeah. It's a great question, and most bureaucrats would always say, "Yeah, of course we need more money." And certainly that's the case. We're getting outspent by Russia and China in particular, and really outspent by China. I mean, like by orders of magnitude. But I also have to say, it kind of in defense of the policymakers that oversee this, there's no lack of understanding of the threat that is faced and the challenge that's before us. I think there's a lack of confidence in the institutions that currently exist to adequately address that threat. I think members of Congress openly question, do we have the right apparatus to actually challenge disinformation as robustly as we need to? Fortunately for me, that's less about my agency and a lot more about the State Department and also the Department of Homeland Security who takes responsibility for protecting the homeland. So the disinformation domestically piece of this goes to them. And we've not really presented a whole of government approach to these challenges, which integrates the domestic piece with the foreign piece. And I think lawmakers balk at pouring money into this because they don't want to just throw money at a problem if the institutions themselves are not capable of solving the problem. Are we short? Are we under-resourced? Absolutely. Our Bulgarian service, which broke stories in the past 6 months that resulted in the resignation of 3 high-level officials, operates on a $500,000 budget a year. I mean, it's an insane return on your investment if you think about $500,000, and it's the first time Bulgarian politicians have been held accountable in 10 years. If we had more money, could we do a lot more of that investigative reporting? Yes. But do we need to make the case that we're capable across the government to deal with these solutions before we ask for those resources? I think that's part of the problem too. And that's why we need you all who are studying public diplomacy to keep on doing the hard work that you're doing so that we can get much better at the job that we're trying to do.
So going back to, I think it was one of the slides, you showed the users and the growth in each medium. Can you explain why from 2016 to 2017 there was more than double growth? I think it went from like 46 to like 100 million users.
Yeah, I can. It's a good question. Yeah, maybe you'll like this answer, maybe you won't. So the way we get, it's an interesting way to measure our audience. We've got robust digital analytics. This is all survey data. And the reason why I mention that is because surveys right now are the only way for us to actually make sure we're not counting people twice, right? So if I just rely on digital analytics, every time someone comes to our website, they'll get counted again, right? So our digital numbers are tremendous. I mean, hundreds of millions, if not billions. But I can't tell you how many of those are duplicate. And if you're thinking about impact, you really want to be able to deduplicate your audience and say X number of original users. A survey lets you do that because you get to ask people, have you accessed this content on the web, on radio, on TV, et cetera? And if it's both, you acknowledge that because we want to take credit for it, but you only count them once. And so when I report our global audience, it's based on hundreds of surveys that we do. We can't afford to do surveys every year in every market, but we try to do 40 or 50 different surveys a year. The big difference in 2017, the jump from 45 million to 104 million, was we were able to do our first nationally representative survey in China, the first one we've been able to do for almost 6 years. It's a hard place to do market research, a hard place for the US government to do market research. We found the right partner who we could trust. But by the very nature of not having any data collected in China for a long time, and then all of a sudden having good data collected in China, and based on the actual raw number of folks that live in China, that number skyrocketed. Our reach in China is about 6.4% of the adult population, but 6.4% of 1.3 billion people is a gigantic number. So that's what happened there.
Now, talking about fake news, I want to ask what your agency is doing. We all know that there's a clear shift to weaponization of information in the internet space now. So I want to ask, what's your agency doing to control the activities of all these 3 groups of people, the hackers, the trolls, and the bots? What are you doing to make sure that your own activity is not hacked so that this information will not affect the general population?
So, one end of the spectrum is, by covering disinformation and the variety of stories that are related, we increase awareness about these issues, and folks are becoming more media literate, and that's part of the solution. But I think what you're asking is, how do we make sure that we're not vulnerable to hacking. And this is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. You know, without getting into too much detail, at different points in time, we know that certain language services have been infiltrated by foreign spies. Am I extremely confident that that is no longer capable of happening? Unfortunately not. You know, part of the challenge is we have operations around the world. We've got a massive headquarters for Radio Free Europe in Prague. The more facilities you have, the less centralized control you have over your security architecture. And so, and especially because we're dealing with journalists who require independence, it becomes really hard to find a good balance of trusting everyone and protecting yourself from bad actors. And so it's something that we really do think quite a bit about. Fortunately, we've got a really smart cyber security and physical security team that have increased our level of training and protections quite a bit. And in particular on the digital side, we've deployed a team to each of our foreign bureaus to train everyone on the kind of best-in-class digital security tools to protect themselves and, frankly, help us understand our own threats. I don't think we're in great shape quite yet, but we recognize that it's a problem and it's a huge risk for us. One of the problems we can't solve, we don't know who does this, but a number of our brands so like VOA 365, which is Voice of America's Persian language effort, has a mirror website which looks just like our website, but if you actually start clicking on it, is a bunch of fake news that is either super critical of the United States government, simply not true, and also meant to embarrass us. How do we solve that? That's a website that we don't own. It looks and feels like our website at the beginning. It's meant, obviously, to discredit the credibility of our journalists, but it's owned and operated by a group of folks that are protected based on internet registration laws in the countries that the site was registered in. We don't have a solution to that yet, other than trying to make people aware of the fact that that's not our website. But there's always a risk that we're drawing people to the wrong website, right? So you asked a really important question, and again, this is a good example of where we need talented young folks like yourselves to help us think through the solutions, because I don't want to pretend that we have a clear path forward on any of these issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powers. I would like to put a couple of things in context. First, how closely were you listening? How many hours per week does the AGM produce? Original content hours per week. How many of you picked that up?
13.
No.
13.
How many hours per week of original content?
Per day.
4,000.
Sorry?
4,000.
4,000. How many hours are there per week? All the math majors. 168 hours per week, right? But they're producing 4,000 hours of content. Now, if you were to compare that, for example, to CNN, which is a global news brand everybody's heard of, CNN produces how much coverage per week? 168, right? So they're producing on a weekly basis something like 25 times CNN. Now you strip out all the advertising from CNN, they're up to about 75 times what CNN is. And for those of us like myself who don't trust government to make wise spending decisions, might I ask, Dr. Powers, what is the budget for AGM per year?
$808 million.
$808 million. Do you know how much revenues CNN generates per year? $17 billion per year in revenues. So their profit, not their revenues, their profit is over $600 million a year. So AGM is a remarkably effective space for what they're doing. Their audience is comparable to CNN's, the content. So I just want to commend AGM for the tremendous work you do. And Dr. Powers' talk really highlights the incredible role of information in geopolitics and global movements. I want to do one thing, and if we could click down one more on your slide.
Which way?
This way. Sorry, we're skipping all this. You will see up here a QR code. And we would like for you to take out your phone, point it at this QR code, and that will lead you to a survey. If you're here to get extra credit, here's where you sign up for it. If you would like to get on our mailing list to hear about other events like this QR code will get you there. We're not going to use it to sell it to CNN or AGM or anybody else. We're not going to use it to survey you. This is just how we will both measure your presence here. So if you're here for extra credit, we'll pass that on to your professors. If you'd like to get on our mailing list, this is how you can get on it. We'd like to hear your feedback on today's talk and other activities. So please join me in thanking Dr. Powers for being here. Small gift for you, because we're all about the orange here. So, we're tremendously grateful for Dr. Powers. This is part of his public service efforts, his outreach efforts within the Agency for Global Media. And so we've got all kinds of cheesy stuff in here for you.
I love it. I love it. I gotta.
Your kids love it.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor and pleasure.
Being here.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming.